The first case of the Omicron variant detected in China. The discovery comes just weeks ahead of the Beijing Winter Olympics. A building dubbed China's Little Red Mansion is shocking Chinese society after a brutal sex slavery case was exposed within its walls. The details are shedding light on the ugly truth of Shanghai police corruption and those linked to it. The Chinese Communist Party says its economy is on the up and up, but a number of state employees are reporting pay cuts up to 20%. Extensive U.S. sanctions are angering Beijing. The regime's foreign ministry warns of retaliation, while the penalties seek to address human rights abuses in the country. And two longtime allies agree to strengthen their ties. The U.S. and Japan are upping their deterrence and response capabilities, looking to combat tensions in the Indo-Pacific. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Ahead of the Beijing Winter Olympics, China is on high alert for potential virus outbreaks. That's as the country detected the first case of the Omicron variant on Monday. Omicron is the latest variant of the CCP virus, and it seems to be more contagious than previous variants. According to health authorities in North China's port city of Tianjin, they discovered the variant in a traveler who entered the city from an undisclosed overseas location last week. The patient was asymptomatic and tested positive on Thursday. The person is currently isolated and being treated in the hospital. CCP virus cases continue to spread in China. More than a dozen companies suspended production in eastern China's Zhejiang province over the outbreak. Zhejiang has reported nearly 200 local cases since the beginning of this month, a big jump compared to only one in October. Due to the lack of transparency in China, NTD cannot independently verify these numbers. But authorities there have already stepped up virus curbs. They halted production, shut down public venues, and imposed targeted lockdowns. And in northeastern China's Heilongjiang province, an online video shows a long line of buses and police cars being dispatched over the weekend. The vehicles were reportedly used to transfer local residents to isolation camps. But local authorities only reported 5 new cases there. And ahead of the Lunar New Year, various cities in China have imposed restrictions to prevent millions of migrant workers from going home for the holidays. A town in South China's Guangxi province ordered business owners to spend the holiday locally. Officials will fine and suspend the businesses that violate the rules. And in a town in North China's Hebei province, all government employees are required to celebrate the holidays locally. We have more updates on the Beijing Winter Olympics. Japan and Estonia could be the latest to join the diplomatic boycott. Over the weekend, a Japanese outlet reported, citing insiders, that senior Japanese officials will likely sit out of the Beijing Olympics. The report adds that a formal decision is likely to come out by the end of the month. And in Northern Europe, the president of Estonia told local media that he will not go to the Chinese capital. He cited political reasons for the decision and added that the neighboring countries would also avoid the games. A Chinese regime spokesperson says in response, quote, "No one cares whether they come or not." For months, human rights groups have called for a boycott of the Beijing Olympics over the CCP's human rights abuses. The U.S. first announced a diplomatic boycott last week. The UK, Australia, and Canada quickly followed. But South Korea appears to break with the U.S. on this issue. The country's president said on Monday that they need China's help to negotiate with North Korea on denuclearization, so the country will not consider a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Games. On the same day, EU diplomats said the EU isn't able to reach an agreement on the boycott anytime soon. China is the EU's second largest trading partner. Reuters says the hesitation reflects the EU's bid to find a middle path between the U.S. and China, as world leaders consider the diplomatic boycott.
No more genocide games!
2 Tibetan students appeared before the Swiss headquarters of the International Olympic Committee on Saturday. They chained themselves to the Olympic rings to call for an international boycott of the Beijing Games.
By awarding China with the genocide games again, the IOC is complicit and saying yes to sports, but no to human rights restoration in China, East Turkestan, Tibet, and Hong Kong.
Other demonstrators joined the pair, calling for a boycott of what they called the genocide games. Police started removing the campaigners after 3 hours of protests. Chinese authorities have been accused of forced labor. They've arbitrarily detained around 1 million Uyghur Muslims and other ethnic minorities in camps since 2016. China denies any wrongdoing, saying the camps are vocational training centers to combat extremism. In San Francisco, 15 human rights groups gathered outside of the NBC Sports office to call on the station not to air the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympic Games.
For National Human Rights Day, numerous human rights groups gathered outside of the NBC Sports office in San Francisco to urge the station not to air the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympic Games. The groups cited China's long track record of human rights abuses and genocide.
And so we ask NBC to stop trying to pretend that sports and the Olympics are divorced from basic moral principles.
We want total and complete boycott of the Beijing Olympic Games.
I believe that the media is also complicit in their silence about the human rights abuses that are going on at the hands of the Chinese government.
The groups thanked the countries that announced a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Games. One speaker also expressed gratitude to the Women's Tennis Association for their response to the Chinese Communist Party.
We also congratulate and say thanks to Women's Tennis Association, WTA, for also announcing and suspending all tournaments and tour in China.
The groups also delivered a letter to NBC signed by 200 human rights groups calling on the station not to air the Beijing Olympic Games. After gathering in front of NBC, the group marched through the city to the Chinese consulate to continue their rally.
It's been described as hell on earth, built from the blood and tears of women. In the heart of a sprawling Chinese metropolis, a building dubbed the Little Red Mansion is exposing some of the ugliest truths about Chinese law enforcement, the underground criminals tied to it, and the price China's most powerless are paying for it. NTD's Penny Zhou has the story.
Details about a recently exposed criminal case are shocking the very heart of Chinese society. The case revolves around Zhao Fuqiang, a Shanghai entrepreneur with a dark secret, tying him to the city's sex slavery underground. He was discovered to have raped and enslaved women, holding them captive inside a brothel reserved for the rich and famous, as well as Chinese officials. He bought a building in downtown Shanghai back in 2014 and repurposed it as a venue to offer glitzy bordello experience for high-end clients. It sits just over 200 yards from the district government building. Zhao lured women to the brothel by inventing job interviews for a state-affiliated TV program named Safe Shanghai that he invested in. Zhao sometimes raped the women he recruited, beat them, and forced them to sexually service his clients. He also blackmailed and trapped them with threats, saying he'd release videos and photos of the encounters. On top of that, he forcibly harvested their eggs, turning them for profit on the black market. At least one woman became infertile due to botched procedures. Zhao kept expanding his illegal business empire until his arrest in 2019. In total, he made an equivalent of around $150 million over the course of 2 decades. Right before Zhao's arrest, the district's top law enforcement chief met with Zhao in his office, warning him of the impending arrest and persuading him to flee Shanghai immediately. He was later sentenced to a suspended death penalty in September 2020. Zhao was able to safely run his operation for years, with support from the dark side of the Chinese policing system and corrupt local officials. Altogether, 37 people were sentenced in the case, including high-ranking Chinese Communist Party officials, a district judge, a district police chief, several police officers, and a number of executives from state-owned companies. All were found to have helped Zhao maintain his operation. According to Chinese media reports, in one case, a female student was hired into Zhao's Red Mansion under the guise of a program assistant job. After discovering the truth, she made multiple escape attempts and tried to report the crimes to the police. But each time, Shanghai police returned her to Zhao. even after the operation came to light. When the case went to trial, the aftermath provoked outrage from Chinese netizens. That's because the women Zhao enslaved were also punished for their so-called crimes, awarded between 8 and 20 years in prison on prostitution charges. In some cases, they received longer prison terms than the officials that abused them. Dong Guangping, a former police officer in China, says the case is only the tip of the iceberg. Under the communist regime, he explained there are private clubs in virtually every city providing sex services to officials.
Many businessmen and government officials have been working together to provide sexual services in private clubs. Many of the cases were treated as regular prostitution cases by police. But the real situation is actually worse. They recruit pretty girls in the name of other jobs and then force them to provide sexual services. Some girls who couldn't stand it in the end came out to report the crime.
Dong Guangping pointed out that without support from local police and communist officials, Zhao could never have run his slavery operation for so long. Chinese media largely stayed silent on the case, other than an expose from media group Caixin. After the report surfaced, a related hashtag made it into Chinese social media platform Weibo's trending topics list. One comment seemed to carry the sentiments of many. This is 2021 in Shanghai, that metropolis with its big surveillance net to protect everyone. But a number of related postings were quickly deleted. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
Some government workers in China are seeing their salaries getting cut by around 1/5 recently. Analysts believe this is because various regions in the country are having financial difficulties.
In recent years, the pandemic and the trade war with the U.S. have slowed down China's economy. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has repeatedly said that people should be ready to live a hard life. This seems to have come true not only for the general population, but also for China's government workers. Chinese state-run media reported that government workers in many places have seen their salaries cut. This happened in China's biggest city, Shanghai, and also in some affluent coastal provinces. Some government workers are complaining on Chinese social media, but something caught the public's attention. The annual income of an average government worker can reach over $30,000. U.S.-based China affairs analyst Qin Peng points out that that's still much higher than what the average Chinese worker earns.
Li Keqiang said 600 million people have an average monthly income of less than 1,000 yuan, or $160. Also, a financial media outlet reported on a Renmin University research. It stated that 964 million people have an average monthly income of less than 2,000 yuan, or $310. It shows that behind the rise of the CCP, in fact, most people have worked hard to feed a handful of people in power, as well as tens of millions of government workers.
The salaries of government workers are very high. Even their retirement benefits are higher than what ordinary people make. The very unreasonable system has created polarization in incomes.
Qin says he believes the pay cuts also reveal that the Chinese regime is facing financial difficulties, so it is forced to go against its own workers. Qin adds that based on what the government workers posted online, the pay cuts range from 15% to 35%. According to official statistics released in August, among all 31 provinces and special municipalities in China, only Shanghai had a fiscal surplus in the first half of the year. In many provinces, the fiscal debt is about $40 billion. Senior Chinese media professional Huang Jinkui shares his insights. He says during financial difficulties, a pay cut for government workers is the simplest and easiest countermeasure for authorities.
Even if government workers are a bit dissatisfied, at least the jobs are still popular at the moment, so they will not resign. Their government workers will not protest openly, so relatively speaking, this method causes the least trouble.
Mrs. Liu, an instructor at a Chinese college, points out another factor. China has a higher proportion of government workers than many other countries, and that adds burden for the Chinese people. For instance, a county in northwestern China's Shaanxi province has a population of 8,000, but there are 2,000 government workers. That means every 4 taxpayers have to support 1 government worker.
This past weekend, top diplomats of the G7 nations met in the UK, and one of the topics dominating their discussion is China. NTD's Penny Zhou brings us more.
Top diplomats from the world's 7 richest democracies met in the British city of Liverpool over the weekend. 2 figures not present at the meeting dominated the discussions: Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping. The diplomats said they are concerned about a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the longer-term worry that kept everyone up at night is China. One official said there were very intense discussions, especially on the Chinese Communist regime.
China represents today a challenge, a strategic and ideological challenge.
We have been clear at this meeting this weekend that we are concerned about the coercive economic policies of China.
In 1979, China's economy was smaller than Italy's, but after it reformed to become a more market-led economy, foreign investment flooded in and is now the world's 2nd largest. But the Chinese regime has used that trade power as a weapon for political gains. Late last year, the regime banned several imports from Australia, including coal, barley, wine, and others. That's in response to Australia requesting an independent inquiry into the origin of the CCP virus. Beijing also suspended imports of apples and pineapples from Taiwan. It was over the island's refusal to acknowledge itself as part of Communist China. The regime has also become a global leader in a range of new technologies. The G7 nations worry that Beijing may use those technologies to export its authoritarian rule to the world.
A couple of weeks ago, we launched British international investment with an increased budget. And that is also why we are working with our friends and partners to help shape the future of technology, to make sure that technology is shaped by the free world, particularly standards in areas like artificial intelligence and quantum technology.
The UK also invited top diplomats from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to discuss China's maritime behavior. Meanwhile, Blinken is heading to Southeast Asia on Monday. He aims to forge a united front against the Chinese regime in the Indo-Pacific.
A high-value artificial intelligence company in China is facing U.S. sanctions. The Treasury Department indicated that the Chinese AI company SenseTime has connections to the Chinese military. The department added the firm to a blacklist composed of Chinese military industrial companies. Washington says SenseTime is involved in human rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslim minority. It accuses the company of having developed facial recognition programs that can determine a target's ethnicity, with a particular focus on identifying ethnic Uyghurs. Getting added to the blacklist blocks U.S. investors from buying or selling the Chinese company's listed shares. In a statement on Saturday, SenseTime said it strongly opposed the designation and accusations. The move has also led the company to delay its $250 million initial public offering in Hong Kong. The Treasury Department's decision to put the firm on the list doesn't come as a surprise. Earlier reports have indicated that many of Beijing's AI projects are explicitly focused on degrading and countering systems at the heart of the U.S.'s military strategy. Beijing is vowing retaliation against the U.S., saying it plans to strike back at what it called Washington's reckless actions. That's after the U.S. imposed extensive sanctions on Friday. The penalties target individuals and entities tied to human rights abuses in a handful of countries, China among them. A spokesperson for China's foreign ministry denounced the sanctions as perverse. He urged the U.S. to take back the decision.
If the U.S. continues to commit reckless, outrageous actions and doesn't stop interfering in China's internal affairs and harming China's interests, China will take strong measures to strike back resolutely.
The measures are the latest in a series of sanctions, in line with Washington's 2-day virtual summit for democracy. At the event, together with over 100 nations, Biden announced initiatives to bolster democracy around the world and support pro-democracy legislation in the United States. Chinese companies now own nearly 20% of stake in Daimler, the maker of Mercedes-Benz. The German car maker announced on Monday that Chinese state-owned Beijing Automotive Group currently has a 9.98% stake in the company. That's in addition to Chinese car company Geely Holding Group's 9.7% stake. It seems the maker of Mercedes-Benz welcomes the Chinese ownership. Its CEO said in a statement that they are happy about the engagement of all long-term oriented shareholders who support our strategy. Beijing Automotive Group's stake in Daimler was only 5% before 2019. The Chinese state-owned company has been Daimler's main partner in China for years. The Chinese firm also operates a number of Mercedes-Benz car factories in Beijing. This could be worrying due to the CCP's military-civil fusion policy. Military-civil fusion is a national strategy where the regime uses the private industry to advance China's military. Car factories in China could also turn into manufacturing plants for the military during wartime. During World War II, Nazi Germany converted civilian factories for military use. By 1944, the German economy was almost completely dedicated to manufacturing for the military. A decades-long alliance between nations in the East and West is getting stronger.
But I'm just particularly pleased to have the opportunity to go in some greater detail about some of the many issues we're already discussing with the G7, but also where Japan and the United States are working so closely together.
The U.S. Secretary of State and Japan's foreign minister are looking to strengthen ties between their two nations. They jointly agreed this weekend on the need to boost the U.S.-Japan alliance, especially amid increasing tensions over Indo-Pacific security. The two diplomats met on Friday during the G7 summit in Liverpool. A Japanese government official told reporters there that in light of the increasingly severe security environment in the region, the ministers agreed it is indispensable to boost the deterrence and response capabilities of the Japan-U.S. alliance. Following those statements, Japan's prime minister said on Monday that he plans to fundamentally strengthen Japan's defense standing. That means developing the ability to strike enemy military bases. The statement seems to come in tandem with China's military buildup and North Korea's nuclear program development. Japan is beginning to bring its military power into the spotlight, following recent Chinese military activities near the island's territory. Japanese troops recently carrying out military exercises involving around 1,300 members of its ground self-defense force. Japan rarely allows foreign media to observe its military exercises, but this time the operations were left open for foreign journalists. The drill was held just a week after Japan completed a naval drill with the U.S., an exercise that involved dozens of warships and aircraft. Australia and South Korea signed a $720 million defense deal on Monday. This as South Korean President Moon Jae-in became the first foreign leader to visit Canberra since the pandemic began.
The contract that we've signed today, I think, speaks volumes about what we believe are the capabilities of the Korean defence industry.
The deal signed between South Korea and Australia on Monday is worth about $1 billion Australian dollars. It's the largest defense contract struck between Australia and an Asian nation. It will allow South Korean defense company Hanwha to provide Australia with 30 self-propelled howitzer artillery weapons, 15 ammunition supply vehicles, and radars to detect enemy artillery.
Korea and Australia uphold the same values, and our position in terms of the geopolitical situation, we are like-minded.
The defense deal comes at a time that Canberra is trying to push back on Beijing's expansion and coercion. But Moon said that the relationship with China is important for South Korea, as it needs Beijing's help to enable denuclearization of North Korea. He added that South Korea is not considering a boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics. At the press conference, Moon also mentioned the proposed end-of-war declaration on the Korean peninsula.
And the relevant parties to this declaration would be the United States, China, and Republic of Korea, and North Korea. And I believe in principle everybody agrees to the declaration.
But he added that negotiations with North Korea had stalled over Pyongyang's precondition for the U.S. to withdraw its so-called hostile policy against the North. Morrison warned that the peace process must not come at the cost of unacceptable compromises with North Korea.
It must come in a way that actually enhances stability, that enhances freedom, not seeks to lock in negative consequences in the longer term.
It's reported that Moon may want to talk to North Korea on a summit level during Beijing's Olympics. But with the U.S. leading many partners to boycott the Games, Moon was stuck in the middle.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.